Understanding how to represent various anatomical features through a drawing process is such a good drawing exercise, and this is because we have such a unique and complex variety of bone structures within various anatomical structures, and this provides us with a very interesting challenge in terms of representing concepts like light and shadow on the surface area of these various anatomical structures. And in today's tutorial, we will be covering the process of how to draw perhaps one of the strangest and most unique structures in the body, and that is the feet. So with that being said, hey guys, my name is Matt. Welcome to another video by artincontext.org, where we explore various art related topics, and in today's tutorial we will be going through a step-by-step process on how to draw feet. Now we will be working with some simple materials in this tutorial, some simple drawing materials, and that is because we'll just be going through the basics of how to draw feet in a realistic way, covering some basic concepts and ideas. And the thing about feet is that they are very unique in the sense that they have a very complex bone structure which causes these subtle protrusions and sometimes harsh protrusions beneath the surface area of the skin, creating a variety of different shadow formations. And as we go through this drawing process, we will also be using a very particular source image. However, you can kind of use any image you would like from the internet or any type of reference image. You can kind of follow the same concepts and steps. But what we're going to do is we're going to start with a very light sketch where we basically start to shape the feet. And the intention with this early stage is to kind of just establish the basic shapes of the various digits or toes within the foot structure, also shaping the main aspects of the foot, such as the balls of the feet and kind of how the foot is slightly narrow near the top. So in this case, we are drawing the feet from a top point perspective, and this is going to make only a certain part of the feet visible. So naturally what we will see is we'll see the top section of the foot, which will make all 10 toes visible to us. Now we will also see a little bit of the inside of the foot from this particular angle, and then that's going to allow us to see the balls of the foot and how that kind of falls into the arc of the foot, which then establishes or kind of flows into the heel of the foot. Now the idea is to slowly work our way through kind of establishing the basic fundamental shapes of the feet, and as we kind of work our way through one foot at a time, we can start to see how naturally the big toe tends to be slightly larger than the rest of the toes. Now all feet are different. Some people have flatter feet, some people have higher arches, some people have more narrow feet, some people have wider feet. In this case, we are working with a very narrow foot type of structure. However, from this particular perspective, the idea is that we want to try and establish this concept of anatomical scale, so kind of making sure that the various features of the foot kind of make sense in relation to one another. Now regardless of what type of foot image you're using as a reference, the idea is to kind of work very lightly at this point, establishing the different features, making sure that the heel flows into the balls of the feet, which then flow into the toes of the feet. And naturally we also want to make sure that the big toe does have this kind of larger structure in relation or compared to that of the rest of the toes. We'll also find that because we are drawing the feet from this very unique perspective, that the toes kind of fall behind one another as it shifts from the big toe all the way to the baby or pinky toe. Now we'll also find that those toes connect to tendons that run along the top of the foot, and that's going to create these grooves and ridges that kind of flow along or form along the top of the foot. And naturally these are already going to be indicative of shadow formations that we kind of want to be aware of at this point. Now naturally, obviously the foot is comprised of various bone structures and tendons that run kind of in a vertical fashion from the top of the foot or down from the top of the foot and under the foot into the toes. Now the toes have these various bone structures that kind of create these protrusions, almost like knuckles as we identify them more colloquially, and they are called phalanges. Now these phalange bones naturally will connect to smaller phalange bones near the tips of the toes, and naturally these are going to create these segments that connect to one another, and those joint areas tend to be quite large. But these bone structures then obviously connect to larger elongated bone structures called the metatarsal bones that kind of shift towards these smaller bone structures such as the navicular tarsal bone, the cuneiform bone. So understanding some bone structure is really important, and this is going to create these various protrusions underneath the surface area of the skin, as well as the various tendons that run through the foot as well. So At this point, again, we're just trying to keep our sketch pretty simple and kind of just establishing the basic shapes. But as we do so with a very light sketch, we can then shift into kind of refining the shape of the foot with a little bit more detailed shading, and this is where we can start to work with some graphite pencil. Now, naturally, beyond the actual features inside of the foot that are creating these various protrusions, we also see that the skin of the feet tend to be quite loose near the actual toes, and this is where we start to see the little creases within the toes, near the phalange bones or the joint areas. And also this is where we start to see how the toenails kind of connect or are placed near the tip of the toes, past the phalange bones or phalange sections of the toes, also just known as the tip of the toes. And this is where we can start to kind of develop a sketch of these various external features, making sense of how they fall in terms of the perspective from which we are actually seeing the foot. So in this case, we want to just basically work quite simple with some marks, and this is slowly where we establish the external features, making sure we understand the distinction between the various toes, making sure we understand how the toenail is placed on the toe. This is more and this feature and drawing this feature is a little bit more of a perspective thing. So sometimes we have these very small toenails or these very rectangular or circular toenails. However, we will find that the skin tends to kind of overlap near the cuticle area onto the base of the toenail, and then naturally the tip of the toenail tends to be more exposed, kind of creating this curvature over the tips of the toes. Now, as we continue with this process, again, just bearing in mind the various bone structures within the foot, we also want to think about some of the tendon sheaths or the tendons that kind of flow along the top of the foot into the toes. And this is where we start to see kind of that ridge formed that flows from the top of the toes kind of through to the base and into the largest section of the ball of the foot, or the largest surface area of the top of the foot. Now, those aren't just bone structures, those also tend to be tendon sheaths, and that's where we want to understand a little bit about how the flexor tendons kind of shift from this larger flexor digitorum brevis tendon that kind of disperses or divides into these smaller, thinner tendon structures, also known as the flexor digitorum brevis tendons, that kind of connect to the base bone structure of the toes as they kind of spread out into their 5 individual digits. Now, naturally, those lumbricals, also the muscles that are placed underneath them, also have a slight protrusion, and these can be very prominent due to the perspective and the kind of pose of the feet. In this case, we can see we are drawing feet, one placed on the ground and one kind of like standing on its toes. So we see this kind of flexing in those tendons and the bone structures, and naturally those are going to create very unique protrusions within the shadow formations and how they kind of are defined on the surface of the skin. So those bone structures and those tendons will create protrusions from beneath the surface of the skin, and that's what we want to think about in terms of representing them as accurately as possible. Now, this time we're basically using our pencils to kind of refine our sketch, kind of reshaping or kind of correcting certain shapes we have established with a very light sketch we've done prior with our blue pencil or whatever pencil you have used. And the intention here is to kind of capture scale and proportions as best we can at this point. Now, in terms of drawing something realistic, especially anatomical structures, it's always good to kind of work very lightly and then refine your drawing slowly through a process of layering. And each time you do so, you kind of just make the shape of the various or the particular structure that you're drawing more accurate each time. And this is where you work really lightly using your eraser and kind of just shaping these various features, slowly refining them into a more realistic representation of actual feet. Now, obviously, when we're drawing anatomical structures as realistic as possible, it does take time to kind of understand, again, the actual anatomical nature of these various features and these very small, complex features. In the case of feet, we really want to know how bones and tendons and muscles work together to create these very unique protrusions from beneath the surface of the skin, especially from this top point of view. And that's what's going to make the drawing a little bit more beautiful in terms of representing shape and form as best as possible. So Do take your time during these early stages, shaping the feet, working really lightly with a pencil. And this is also where we start to see how those tendons kind of flow towards the ankle area. So we also want to capture those bones around the ankle. We want to understand how that larger flexor digitorum tendon sheath kind of connects into the upper section of the foot, depending on how much of the foot you're actually drawing. In this case, we will draw some of the ankle as well. So we want to make sure that we understand how the navicular bone does create this slight protrusion from beneath the surface of the skin, as well as that large digitorum tendon sheath, as well as the calcaneus bone, or otherwise known as the heel bone, or the tarsal bone. And naturally, a very protruding quality is what we describe as the ankle, which is actually the fibula, and that is basically the lower fibular section that has this protrusion that kind of protrudes laterally from outside of the foot on either side of the ankle bone. And yeah, this is kind of like what we really want to understand in terms of bone structure, tendon structure, muscle structure, and how these cause various protrusions to best accurately represent them within a drawing. Now, this drawing shouldn't take very quick. It should take time, but naturally by doing so, we can start to understand a little bit more, or be more informed in terms of where the shadows should form within the feet and how this creates these various shadow formations. So now this is where we can start shifting into our shading process. Again, you can use graphite pencil. In this case, we are working kind of with a blue sketching pencil, but this is where we start to develop that very subtle shading, that shadow formation. And we also want to be conscious of the perspective once again, and how that is also interacting with the light source. Now, being conscious from the direction from which the light source is present is also going to have a particular interaction with the surface area of your feet. And naturally, this is what's going to create the shadow formations at all. So if the light source is coming from a left side, obviously the shadow formations will be a little bit more prominent on the right side, and vice versa. And this concept can obviously be applied to any type of angle from which your light source is coming from. So if it's from the top, then naturally the shadow formation will be less visible because it will be beneath the feet. Now, the shadow formations are what are going to cause the definition within the structural qualities of the feet, and kind of representing these various kind of mentioned bone structures and tendons that kind of protrude from beneath the surface of the skin. But the idea is to still keep your drawing fairly light, slowly working out these shadow formations, slowly trying your best to understand what is causing these shadow formations, again, beneath the surface area of the skin, and then how they kind of connect to one another. So how do the bone structures in the toes connect to these tendon sheaths, as well as the metatarsal bones that run through the top section of the foot, and how that connects into the larger bones near the ankles, such as the tarsal bone or the calcaneus bone and the fibula bone, and so on and so on. And naturally, this is going to help you understand what is also going to be kind of exposed or less exposed to a light source. So naturally, if we are drawing, let's say, the fibula bone within this particular drawing, and drawing it from the top angle, that is going to cast a shadow because it protrudes or be more exposed to light, and therefore there'll be more shadowing on the heel. So thinking about concepts like that through this process of developing your shading is really important, and ultimately it's going to enable you to understand better a little bit more about the placement of these various shadow formations. But otherwise, guys, once we have kind of worked in some light shading, we're going to move on to working now with darker mediums, and this is where we'll start using our actual dark graphite pencils. In this case, maybe work with something a little bit soft like a 7B or any pencil above 6B, and this is where we're going to start using the light shading qualities within this drawing to kind of assist us as we define these shading moments and features a little bit more significantly with some darker marks. Now, the idea is to use your light shading as a reference point, and this is where we can start making little gradients within our shading to emphasize certain features a little bit more significantly. And the intention here, once again, is to now utilize the softer shading to guide us in developing a little bit more vivid contrast in the shadow formations on the foot. And this is where we can also start to think about making these very subtle transitions and gradients between shadowed areas areas or within shadowed areas to emphasize features, and then how they become slightly more exposed to a light source. And this is particularly why I have emphasized the idea of really understanding the anatomical nature of what is beneath the surface of the skin, because this is going to help you understand where to place shadows. So as we kind of shift to these larger bone structures in the feet, we can then develop shadows in a way that makes sense, create these transitions, and then kind of leave out certain negative spaces that would make sense in terms of what would be more exposed to the light source due to the protruding nature of those features. Now, as we kind of work our way through the feet, this is where we simply just want to take our time. We also want to consider other features beneath the surface of the skin that might be more visible, and this is where features such as veins also start to kind of play a role in terms of how they flow along the surface of the skin. But again, it's all a matter of taking your time. You really want to understand the various joint structures in the toes, developing shading around that, also developing shading around the grooves between the toes, thinking about how those would be less exposed to a light source, slowly working your way through these transitions in terms of how they flow into the features in the upper foot, and then ultimately how that flows into the features in the ankle area, and naturally thinking about the bone structures, the very large bone structures that would create these very stark shadow formations. Now again, from this point on, it's simply a matter of taking your time, slowly working with a darker medium each time, really working on the transitional qualities of your shading. This is where you can also consider the medium that you're using and what is effective in terms of developing these qualities and these shadow formations. In this case, we're working with the smooth shading process, but you can easily apply a darker medium such as pen or something that kind of works well with other shading processes or techniques such as cross-hatching and so on. But the idea is that once we understand the shape of the foot, develop it and refine it into identifiable features, work out some light shading, we can then emphasize and enhance those qualities with darker shading. But as we do so, again, a really important thing to think about in terms of shading is to not underestimate the quality of negative space and how to create those transitions between the darker shadowed areas and how they kind of become light as those or various features become more exposed to a light source, creating these more realistic moments of illuminated areas in the foot, on the surface area of the foot. But otherwise, guys, from this point onward, it's simply a matter of building up your shadow formations and transitions and gradients, thinking about bone structures, thinking about protruding features or features that have qualities of indentation caused by other protruding features. And then you can also slowly start to develop an actual shadow around the foot in terms of how it makes contact with the ground, just to kind of contextualize the feet a little further. But otherwise, guys, there you have it, a simple process on how to draw feet. It is a little bit complex in terms of kind of understanding the shape of the foot, the various anatomical features, but then what is really the key takeaway here is always start very vague and simple, understand the general shape, work on scale, refine those features, develop a very light sense of shading to represent the more complex features beneath the surface of the skin, and then slowly enhance them with some darker materials or mediums that you have available and that suits your drawing. But otherwise, guys, if you did like this video, please let us know in the comment section below if you are interested in similar or related topics around anatomical structures and anatomy drawing. We'd love to hear back from you guys, and you can also show your support by liking and subscribing. This is a very small channel that we're trying to grow, and the more you show your support by liking and subscribing, the more it enables us to make more interesting art related content for you guys, which we love to do. But thanks again for tuning in. That is it from me today. Until next time, cheers.